In this data tutorial, we'll be talking about stem and leaf plots and box plots. I'm going to recreate some of the stem and leaf plots and box plots that I did in the lectures. These will be for observation level data only. So let's start with a stem and leaf plot. And the one that I did in the lectures was this diastolic blood pressure data set, and it had 23 observations. I've already pulled it up. Let me show it to you. Here's the diastolic blood pressure data set. It has 3 variables and 23 observations. We know the stem and leaf plot is going to display these diastolic blood pressure values, and the stems are going to be this first 10 place values, and the leaves are going to be the ones place value. For the stem and leaf, actually it's going to be easier to type this into the command line, and I remember it. I'll show you what it is for the drop-down menus, but this one is actually very easy to remember. So the command is stem, small letters, and I see over here, I'm being careful with what's capital letters and what's not. I see that the variable name is all capital letters, so I'm using all capital letters for the variable name diastolic blood pressure, DBP. And it does my stem and leaf plot. And I see, for example, that this value right here represents the diastolic blood pressure value 90. And I remember the syntax for the, if I want to split the stem, in other words, if I had, this isn't a particularly applicable example, but let's say if there's lots of values and I want each interval here, let's say these 70s, there were lots of them, and I want to make that into 2 lines, the first half of the 70s and the second half of the 70s, I would type stem DBP lines 2, and it would put 2 lines for every interval, every bin here. So the 70s are the first half of the 70s and the second half of the 70s. And I said I would show you the drop-down menus that they're equivalent of that. And this is not very intuitive. Go to Statistics, Summaries, Distributional Plots and Tests, Stem and Leaf Display. And then pick the variable, in this case is diastolic blood pressure, and you can use the default or you can pick the number of lines and then either submit or OK. And it produces what we just did. Like I said, it's easier to just type that one in. But you'll see, again, it keeps a log of what we've done. That drop-down menu just created what we just did. For the box plot, I'll show you the graph that I did in the lectures. I'll just open that up. I had saved it as a graph file. And I see that I've done box plots, side-by-side box plots of the diastolic blood pressures of these 23 individuals. So let's see if we can reproduce this graph. I'm going to do this one with the drop-down menu and have it produce the code for me, and then I'll show you the code. Let's go to Graphics, Boxplot, Vertical, and my variable is going to be diastolic blood pressure. My categories are going to be what's on the x-axis, so you'll notice that they're side by side, and what's on the x-axis is those genders. So drop down, I'm going to do the genders. And as usual, I can make modifications in these different tabs. Some of the ones I'm going to pay particular attention to will be the titles and the y-axis. Let's look at those. The titles, I'm going to want to make that descriptive. So I typed in my title. Titles need to be descriptive. I always like to put the sample size in the title. That lets my reader know something about how big the data set is. The y-axis is going to be the diastolic blood pressure values, and I'm going to include the units. And let's see how it's looking. I may need to make some more modifications. If I want to edit anything, I could go back to the pop-up box and go to the tab that needed modifications, or I could come over here to this editor, that little button right here, that's the graph editor, and then that will let me make modifications to the titles and such, the axes, etc. But this is looking pretty good for a first attempt. Some things I would be looking at are the titles, make sure the units are here, make sure that these are labeled very well, the x-axis labels. I'm looking at the order here. With only 2 things, the order is not particularly important, but a lot of times side-by-side things have 4, 5, 6 things, and I would want some kind of meaningful order. So one thing I can see is that my drop-down box has created this code right here. I can see it 2 different places. It created this code, graph, box, diastolic blood pressure, over gender, and then it created all these titles. This is something I don't want to type in. And also I want to save this graph, and then I can always come back and edit it. I save it as a type GPH, and I can always then come back and edit it as needed. But the point for this is to communicate to the reader to be able to compare the diastolic blood pressures for these 2 genders. A good first attempt for a side-by-side box plot. And so the point of this Stata tutorial was to do a stem and leaf plot for this observation level data, and also to show you an example of side-by-side box plots for these observation level data.